Folks, in today's video, we are going to break down a massive structural shift that is silently catching the entire stock market completely off guard. Everybody keeps asking me for the actual secret to building massive wealth over time. And honestly, every single time I tell people the boring truth, they flat out refuse to believe me. They want the fast dopamine hit, the overnight options flip, and the crazy speculative bubbles. But the real game of wealth is rooted deeply in simple math and personal psychology. Right now, in May 2026, the financial media is screaming about inflation and interest rate hikes, but they are completely missing the underlying demand destruction that is staring us right in the face. If you actually look at the data instead of the mainstream headlines, you will see that central banks like the European Central Bank and even the Federal Reserve are setting themselves up to absolutely overreact. They are preparing to raise benchmark policy rates right into an economic slowdown, and the consequences are going to be historic. Even over in Europe, where policymakers tend to be aggressively hawkish as a group, several officials have recently come forward expressing serious and growing concerns about the demand side of the economy. They are looking specifically at jobs and workers, and what they see is not a booming recovery, but a system that was already weak before the latest energy complications even began. Two of the world's leading energy agencies just absolutely slashed their energy demand growth forecasts in a way that we only see during major structural crises, like 2020 or 2009. Worldwide, the initial indications, especially when it comes to the labor market, are already beginning to look like a historic energy shock case. The numbers are so stark that even central bankers are starting to reassess what the real risk to the global economy truly might be. Now, officially, they still believe by and large that the primary fight is against consumer price inflation. However, we are getting more and more data points on the other side of the ledger showing that the real threat is structural economic contraction. These warning signs were greatly aided by the latest forecast from the United States Energy Information Administration, which just slashed its energy demand growth estimate to basically zero for this entire year. And its international counterpart, the International Energy Agency, went even further with its analysis. The International Energy Agency stated that it now believes global energy demand will outright shrink this year. Let that sink in for a second. Global energy demand is projected to contract. The last time we saw that happen was during the global lockdowns of 2020. And before that, during the depths of the great financial crisis in 2009. There is one critical factor in all of this that most retail investors completely overlook or just dismiss entirely, and that includes central bankers and certainly the participants in the green daily stock market. That factor is the true state of the global economy before this current shock even started, and that is exactly where the hard evidence makes a monumental difference right now. While every talking head on television is obsessed with inflation and predicting how many rate hikes we are going to get, we have a massive cluster of data points across Europe and global oil demand that suggest we are moving rapidly toward a historic economic breaking point. If you look at the manufacturing sector in Europe, it was not long ago that it was deep in recessionary territory, flirting with financial crisis levels. Particularly in Germany, it felt like every single month the manufacturing data got worse and worse. Companies were actively laying off workers, and then the government stepped in and announced a wave of military spending. Immediately, everyone got incredibly excited, thinking that government spending was the magic wand that would turn everything around. Then the oil shock hit, and you saw a temporary front running of demand. We saw the exact same story play out right here in the United States. Suddenly, the media started celebrating a factory, claiming that everything was going to be completely fine and that the industrial economy was booming. But beneath that temporary surface narrative, there is a massive underlying structural problem. You do not see actual hiring. What you are seeing instead is a temporary pickup in hours, worked in a few specific cases, along with some superficial optimism from factory managers hoping things will improve. But companies are fundamentally not reacting by adding permanent headcount to the labor market. And that is the exact structural trap Europe is facing right now. European businesses have already laid off so many people because they know deep down that consumer demand is coming down. When we talk about inflation, we have to separate the structural causes. Yes, an energy shock causes prices to go up across the entire globe. We are seeing it clearly at the producer level, the intermediate level, and at the final consumer level. Costs are absolutely going higher, but there is a massive difference between the right kind of inflation and the wrong kind of inflation. The right kind of inflation is demand LED, meaning incomes are rising, the job market is incredibly robust, and consumers are eagerly competing for goods and services because they have excess wealth. The wrong kind of inflation is supply-side cost pushes, like an artificial energy spike. And that is the exact nightmare scenario we are dealing with right now. When energy prices spike in a weak economy, corporate profit margins get severely squeezed. Everyday consumers are forced to rapidly pull back on discretionary spending because their weekly paychecks are swallowed up by utility bills and gas pumps. We have seen this exact historical tape replay time and time again throughout economic history, and we know exactly what the endgame looks like. Companies eventually have no choice but to cut hours and initiate mass layoffs to preserve capital. Out of the last 5 recessions in the United States were preceded by sharp energy shocks. How the European economy is supposed to come out of this situation remotely unscathed is completely beyond me. It looks incredibly obvious where they are headed, which is yet another legitimate recession. And of course, we know exactly what the European Central Bank is going to do because it is what they always do. They are highly likely to raise interest rates right into the teeth of an economic slowdown. The European Central Bank has a special talent for hiking interest rates directly into an economic contraction, just like they did back in 2008 and then twice more in 2011 right before that recession started. It almost feels like a prerequisite for getting a top job at an international central bank. You must demonstrate a complete inability to read the labor market. The real metric that eventually forces these officials to realize they are wrong is when unemployment claims start to spike. And when unemployment rises before you even factor in the full downstream impact of higher energy costs, the entire bullish narrative falls completely apart. The mainstream narrative was that the global economy was supposed to be picking up momentum in late 2025 and turning around completely in early 2026. Instead, if you look at European gross domestic product numbers and specific employment metrics for countries like France, the reality is incredibly grim. France has actually posted negative payroll numbers for 2 consecutive years running, and their official unemployment rate has now climbed to 8.1%. Across the entire euro area, employment growth has slowed down to basically nothing. The year-over-year change in total employment across the eurozone is a mere half of 1%, which historically sits well within deep recessionary territory. So if you are an honest central bank official sitting in those meetings, you have to look at the data and admit that the underlying labor market was already structurally weak before this energy shock hit. And we know exactly how the combination of a weak labor market and an energy shock ends. They go together like a textbook definition of economic contraction. Before we dive into what this means for your personal investment portfolio and how the forward interest rate markets are pricing this, I want to take a brief moment to talk about today's video sponsor because they are addressing a massive economic problem that I have been warning you about for years. I almost never do advertisements on this channel, and I say an absolute no to the vast majority of companies that reach out to me. But I was genuinely thrilled to partner with Monetary Metals because they are solving a fundamental issue for long-term savers. We all know that holding physical gold is a classic safe haven asset during times of global macroeconomic instability and central bank monetary destruction. But the historical problem with gold is that if it is just sitting in a vault, it does not produce anything. It just sits there, costing you money for storage fees while producing zero cash flow. Monetary Metals completely fixes that structural flaw. They allow you to earn a real wealth yield paid directly in physical gold, without you ever having to give up your underlying ownership of the asset. This is not a speculative digital token fund, and it is not a paper claim certificate. It is your actual physical gold working for you productively in corporate funding and leasing structures. Every single month, more physical gold gets deposited directly into your account. The entire process is incredibly simple, completely transparent, and fully insured against loss. If you believe in gold as a foundational long-term store of real value, this model changes the game entirely. You can go to monetary-metals.com/NDR for all of the specific legal details and data. That is monetary-metals.com/NDR to see how you can stop letting your capital sit idle. We absolutely thank them for supporting the channel. And now let us get right back to the structural market analysis. The reality of the situation is that central bankers all around the world desperately want to hike interest rates. They wanted to bring interest rates up because they knew deep down that the global economic foundation was fundamentally weak. If they could artificially push interest rates higher during a period of superficial growth, it would give them an excuse to cut interest rates later and claim they are saving the world with monetary stimulus. But the systemic problem right now is that interest rates are still relatively low in a historical context. Even if they cut interest rates back down to absolute zero, the actual structural impact it will have on the real productive economy is basically nothing. Central bankers are trying to convince the investing public that their policy tools make a massive difference, but they have absolutely zero margin for error left. This is exactly why you can hear a distinct note of nervousness whenever these officials give public speeches. They are staring at a clear-cut situation where their traditional playbook of cutting interest rates and launching quantitative easing is simply not going to work. Their institutional credibility, which is already rock bottom for independent macro analysts, is about to be completely destroyed in the eyes of the general public. If you want to see what the smart money is actually doing right now, you have to look directly at the bond curves, the yield curves, and the forward interest rate markets. Specifically, if you look at the Euribor futures market, which is the euro-denominated twin to the secured overnight financing rate futures market in the United States, the data tells a fascinating story. There is a distinct frown shape in the forward interest rate curves. That frown shape means the market is pricing a high probability that central bankers will push interest rates up in the immediate short term due to headline inflation fears, but will ultimately be forced to turn right around and aggressively slash interest rates as economic reality sets in. The Euribor futures curve was already inverted before we even reached the end of February, long before the latest geopolitical conflicts disrupted global trade. That inversion proves that market participants thoroughly understood the underlying economy was structurally weak before any external energy shock appeared. Central bankers absolutely loathe facing economic weakness when interest rates are low because they believe they do not have enough altitude. If an economy hits a recession when benchmark rates are at 5%, the central bank can cut interest rates by 400 basis points and claim they are providing massive monetary stimulus. But if you are starting at a much lower level and facing deep structural weakness, your tools are fundamentally useless. The market is currently pricing a short-term reaction to inflation, but the long-term fundamentals of economic growth are turning down sharply. The average worker and the average household are seeing their disposable income completely wiped out. Average hourly earnings adjusted for inflation recently turned negative for the first time in 4 years. When consumers are forced to allocate a massive percentage of their weekly income strictly to non-discretionary expenses like food, heating, and transportation, they have to drastically cut back on discretionary retail goods and services. As that drop in consumer spending back flows through the entire commercial economy, corporate revenues will stall, business hours will be cut, and jobs will be permanently lost. The central banks will be left playing a desperate game of monetary catch-up. They are terrified of second-order effects, meaning they are afraid that a temporary spike in raw oil prices will spill over broadly into entrenched inflation expectations. They are worried that every business will permanently raise prices in a self-fulfilling spiral. But the market curve is shouting that this is an absolute impossibility because there is zero demand-side support. Incomes are not rising sustainably, and the global job market is actively deteriorating. The only way the world can respond to an external energy shock is by contracting elsewhere. You can try to pass higher input costs along to consumers on absolute necessities, but it happens at the direct expense of the rest of the economy. The third-order impact of an energy spike is a violent drop in aggregate demand for everything else. Even mainstream corporate economists are starting to get cold feet regarding further interest rate hikes. Senior analysts at major international institutions like Societe Generale are noting that the visible weakness in the underlying economy will naturally dampen domestic inflationary pressures, meaning further policy tightening should absolutely not be a done deal. If you look at historical energy cycles, there is a critical limit to how long an economy can absorb high energy prices before hitting a point of no return. In a booming, fundamentally sound economy, the system can sometimes absorb high energy costs for several months through savings and credit expansion. But in a structurally weak or slowing economic environment, that point of no return is roughly 2 months. We are now past that critical 2-month mark, and the economic data is beginning to sour rapidly. Corporate profit margins are getting heavily squeezed, and businesses have absolutely no choice but to scale back. This is exactly why the international energy agencies are forecasting a severe drop in global oil demand growth.